Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished checking the last aircraft engine in the hangar. At 35, she had built a solid reputation as one of the best aircraft mechanics at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. Her colleagues respected her knowledge of fighter jets, though they often wondered how someone who had never served in the military could understand these complex machines so well. "Hey, Sarah, you heading home?" called out Jake, a younger mechanic who had been working alongside her for the past 2 years. He always stayed late, hoping to learn more from her expertise. "In a few minutes," she replied, her voice carrying a slight tremor that she quickly suppressed. The day had been particularly difficult. A group of F-22 Raptor pilots had brought their aircraft in for routine maintenance, and seeing those sleek, powerful jets had stirred memories she had spent over a decade trying to forget. Sarah gathered her tools methodically, each movement precise and practiced. Her hands, though now calloused from years of mechanical work, still remembered the feel of a fighter jet's controls. She could still recall the sensation of pulling G's during sharp turns, the rush of breaking the sound barrier, and the intense focus required to operate the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. As she walked to her pickup truck in the employee parking lot, Sarah caught her reflection in the side mirror. Her dark hair was now shorter and streaked with early gray, and lines had formed around her eyes from years of squinting at engine components. She looked nothing like the young woman who had once been among the elite few selected to fly the F-22. Raptor, the drive home to her small apartment took 20 minutes through the quiet streets of Colorado Springs. Sarah had chosen this place specifically because it was far enough from the base to feel separate from her work, yet close enough that she could respond to emergency calls when needed. Her apartment was spartanly furnished, with only the essentials and a few books about aviation history on the shelves. That evening, as she heated a simple dinner in the microwave, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Lisa in California. "Saw some news about the Air Force today. Made me think of you. Hope you're doing well." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing back a simple, "Thanks. Doing fine." Lisa was the only family member who knew the truth about Sarah's past, though even she didn't know all the details. Their parents had died in a car accident 8 years ago, taking with them any obligation Sarah felt to explain her sudden disappearance from the Air Force and her equally sudden reappearance as a civilian contractor. After dinner, Sarah sat on her small balcony overlooking the mountains. The evening air was crisp, and she could see the lights of aircraft taking off and landing at the Air Force Academy in the distance. Each set of lights reminded her of nights when she had been the one in the cockpit, responsible for million-dollar aircraft and split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She remembered her first solo flight in an F-22, how the aircraft had responded to her touch like a living thing. The Raptor was unlike any other fighter jet in the world, with its stealth capabilities and advanced avionics systems. Only a select few pilots were ever chosen to fly it, and even fewer were women. Sarah had been proud to be among that elite group, had lived and breathed the mission every day. But that was before everything changed. Before the incident that had forced her to make an impossible choice between her career and her conscience. Before she had walked away from everything she had worked toward since childhood, leaving behind not just her military career, but her identity as a pilot. The official story, the one in her personnel file, stated that Captain Sarah Martinez had requested early discharge due to family obligations. The truth was far more complicated and infinitely more painful. She had been forced to choose between exposing a cover-up that reached high into the Air Force command structure or quietly disappearing from military service forever. Sarah had chosen silence, but the cost had been enormous. She had lost not just her career but also her sense of purpose, her community of fellow pilots, and the daily rush of flying the most advanced aircraft ever built. For months after leaving the Air Force, she had struggled with depression and a sense of purposelessness that had nearly consumed her. It was Jake, ironically, who had helped her find her way back to aircraft. Though in a completely different capacity, a former Air Force mechanic himself, he had recommended her for the civilian contractor position when he noticed her unusual knowledge of fighter jet systems. The work paid well and allowed her to stay connected to aviation without the military structure she had grown to distrust. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she performed the same ritual she had maintained for over a decade. She opened a small wooden box hidden in her bedroom closet and looked at the contents. her pilot's wings, several commendation medals, and a photograph of her standing beside an F-22 Raptor with her former squadron. In the photo, she was smiling broadly, her flight suit crisp and her posture confident. She looked like someone who belonged in that world, someone who had found her calling. Sarah touched the pilot's wings gently before closing the box. Tomorrow would be another day of routine maintenance. Another day of pretending that her intimate knowledge of these aircraft came from textbooks and training manuals rather than hundreds of hours in the cockpit. Another day of maintaining the careful balance between using her expertise to do excellent work and avoiding questions about how she had acquired such detailed knowledge. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would be the day everything changed, the day when her carefully constructed new life would collide with the secrets of her past, in a way that would force her back into the cockpit of the very aircraft she had spent 11 years trying to forget. The emergency alarm pierced through the quiet morning air at Peterson Air Force Base, jolting Sarah from her routine inspection of a transport aircraft. The sound was different from the usual maintenance alerts she was accustomed to hearing. This was the kind of alarm that meant something serious was happening, something that required immediate attention from everyone on the base. Sarah looked up to see several Air Force personnel running toward the command center, their faces tense with urgency. Jake appeared at her side, slightly out of breath from sprinting across the hangar. "Sarah, they're calling all senior maintenance staff to the briefing room immediately," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Something big is going down. I heard fragments over the radio about a situation developing up north." As they made their way to the briefing room, Sarah noticed the unusual level of activity around the base. Military vehicles were moving with purpose, and she could see additional security personnel taking positions at various checkpoints. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to put the entire base on high alert. The briefing room was packed with maintenance supervisors, flight instructors, and various other personnel. At the front of the room stood Colonel Rebecca Hayes, the base commander, alongside several other high-ranking officers Sarah didn't recognize. The colonel's expression was grim as she waited for everyone to settle into their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a developing situation that requires immediate response," Colonel Hayes began, her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering critical information. Approximately 2 hours ago, a severe weather system moved through the Denver area, causing multiple aircraft incidents at Buckley Air Force Base. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Buckley was less than an hour away, and she knew they housed several F-22 squadrons there. "The situation is this," the colonel continued, pulling up a map on the large screen behind her. 3 F-22 Raptors were conducting a routine training exercise when the storm hit. 2 aircraft managed to land safely, but the third experienced significant electrical system damage and made an emergency landing at a civilian airfield about 30 miles northeast of Denver. The room remained silent as everyone absorbed the information. Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily in her lap. "The pilot, Captain Rodriguez, is uninjured but trapped in hostile territory," Colonel Hayes said, and Sarah realized she meant the aircraft had landed in an area with limited access and potential security risks. "The aircraft contains classified technology that cannot be left unguarded, and the electrical damage means it cannot be flown out under its own power." One of the maintenance supervisors raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's the recovery plan?" "That's where things get complicated," the colonel replied. "The weather system is intensifying, and we have a narrow window to extract both the pilot and the aircraft. The terrain where the F-22 is located is not suitable for our usual recovery equipment, and the storm is preventing helicopter access." Colonel Hayes clicked to the next slide, which showed technical specifications of the damaged aircraft. "Our only option is to send in a team to repair the electrical systems on site and fly the aircraft out. However, this requires a pilot qualified on the F-22 who can also perform complex electrical repairs under field conditions." Sarah's heart began to race. She knew where this was heading. "The problem is that all our current F-22 pilots are either deployed overseas or attending a critical conference in Washington. We cannot recall them in time to meet our operational window. The storm system is expected to worsen significantly within the next 6 hours, making any rescue attempt impossible after that point." Another officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, what about pilots from other bases?" "We've checked every option," Colonel Hayes responded. "Weather is grounding aircraft across the entire region. and we cannot get a qualified pilot here in time through conventional means." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the impossible situation. Sarah felt sweat beginning to form on her palms as she realized that her carefully guarded secret might be the only solution to this crisis. Colonel Hayes looked directly at the maintenance staff. "We need someone who understands F-22 systems better than anyone else on this base. Someone who might be able to both repair the aircraft and, potentially," she paused as if considering her words carefully, "assist with the extraction if absolutely necessary." Sarah felt every eye in the room turning toward her. Over the past several years, she had gained a reputation as the person who could fix any F-22 system, often solving problems that stumped even the most experienced technicians. Her colleagues had always attributed this to exceptional study and natural mechanical aptitude. Never suspecting the truth, "Martinez," called out Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the head of maintenance operations, "you're our best F-22 specialist. What do you think about the repair requirements?" Sarah forced herself to remain calm as she stood up. The electrical systems on the F-22 are complex, but if it's weather-related damage, it's likely to be in the primary power distribution unit or the backup systems. With the right equipment, field repairs should be possible. Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly. "Excellent. We're assembling a team to go to the site immediately. Martinez, we need you to lead the technical repair effort." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, though her mind was racing with the implications. She would be working directly on an F-22 again, touching the system she had once known as intimately as her own heartbeat. As the briefing continued with logistics and timing details, Sarah found herself studying the technical readouts on the screen. Despite 11 years away from flying, she could still read the aircraft's systems like a familiar book. She could see exactly what had likely failed and how to fix it, but there was something else troubling her about the situation. If the weather was as bad as they said, and if the terrain was truly unsuitable for normal recovery operations, there might come a moment when the only way to save the aircraft and complete the mission would be for someone to fly the F-22 out manually. Sarah looked around the room at the assembled personnel. None of them were pilots, and certainly none were qualified on the F-22. If that moment came, if the choice was between losing a $100 million aircraft with classified technology or revealing her true background, what would she do? As the briefing concluded and teams began forming for the rescue operation, Sarah gathered her tools with mechanical precision. She told herself she was just going to fix the aircraft and come home. She told herself that her flying days were over, and that she could complete this mission without anyone discovering her secret. But deep down, as she prepared for what might be the most challenging day of her post-military life, Sarah Martinez knew that some secrets were too important to keep when lives and national security hung in the balance. The convoy of military vehicles moved through increasingly difficult terrain as the storm intensified around them. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of the lead Humvee, her toolkit secured beside her and her mind focused on the task ahead. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the wind was strong enough to make the heavy vehicle sway occasionally on the narrow mountain road. "How much further?" asked Lieutenant Morrison, the young officer leading the recovery team. He had been assigned to coordinate the mission, though it was clear he was relying heavily on Sarah's technical expertise. "According to GPS, about 15 minutes," replied Sergeant Kim, who was driving. "But this weather is making everything more difficult. I can barely see 50 feet ahead." Sarah stared out at the gray landscape, her thoughts drifting between the technical challenges ahead and the memories that being near an F-22 again would inevitably bring back. She had volunteered for this mission, knowing the risks to her carefully maintained cover, but she also knew that Captain Rodriguez was depending on them, and the classified technology in that aircraft could not fall into the wrong hands. "Martinez, talk me through what we're likely to find when we get there," Lieutenant Morrison said, turning to face her. His voice carried the authority of someone trying to maintain command, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty underneath. "If the electrical damage is as extensive as the preliminary reports suggest, we're looking at problems with the primary flight control systems," Sarah explained, falling back into the technical language that felt natural to her. "The F-22's fly-by-wire system means that without proper electrical function, the aircraft becomes essentially unflyable. But you can fix it, right?" Sergeant Kim asked from the driver's seat. "The repairs themselves aren't the problem," Sarah replied carefully. The challenge will be working in these conditions and having enough time to test the systems properly before. She paused, realizing she had been about to say, before takeoff rather than before recovery operations. Lieutenant Morrison didn't seem to notice her hesitation. The weather forecast shows we have maybe 3 hours before conditions become completely impossible. After that, we'll have to leave the aircraft and extract just the pilot. Sarah nodded, though she knew that leaving the F-22 wasn't really an option. The stealth technology and advanced systems in that aircraft represented years of development and billions of dollars in research. More importantly, there were aspects of the F-22's capabilities that were still classified at the highest levels. As they crested a hill, Sarah could see the makeshift landing site in the distance. The civilian airfield was little more than a grass strip used by small private aircraft, and she could immediately see why conventional recovery methods wouldn't work. The F-22 sat at an odd angle on the narrow runway, its landing gear partially sunk into the soft ground that had been saturated by the storm. "There she is," Lieutenant Morrison said, and Sarah heard a note of awe in his voice. Even damaged and sitting awkwardly on the small airfield, the F-22 Raptor was an impressive sight. Its angular stealth design and powerful presence made it clear why this aircraft was considered the most advanced fighter jet in the world. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she got her first close look at an F-22 in over 11 years. The aircraft looked exactly as she remembered, though she could see the scorch marks along the fuselage where electrical systems had been damaged by the lightning strike. Captain Rodriguez appeared from a small hangar building where he had taken shelter. He was a young pilot, probably in his late 20s, and Sarah could see the frustration and concern on his face as he approached their vehicles. "Thank God you're here," he said to Lieutenant Morrison. "I've been monitoring the weather reports and it's getting worse by the hour. We need to get this bird out of here as soon as possible." Sarah stepped out of the Humvee and immediately felt the full force of the storm. The wind was strong enough to make walking difficult, and the rain stung her face as she made her way toward the aircraft. But as she got closer to the F-22, all the discomfort faded into the background. Standing next to the aircraft again felt like coming home and facing her worst nightmare at the same time. Every line of the F-22's design was familiar to her, from the distinctive engine intakes to the angular cockpit canopy. She found herself automatically checking details that only a pilot would notice. The position of the control surfaces, the condition of the tires, the way the aircraft was sitting on its landing gear. "The damage looks worse than I expected," Captain Rodriguez said, joining her beside the aircraft. "The lightning hit us during a banking maneuver, and it knocked out most of our electrical systems simultaneously. I barely managed to get her down in one piece." Sarah nodded as she began her visual inspection of the aircraft. "You did well to land safely in these conditions," she told him, and she meant it. Landing an F-22 with compromised electrical systems required exceptional skill and quick thinking. "The question now is whether we can get her flying again," Captain Rodriguez continued. "I've never seen electrical damage this extensive in an F-22. Usually, the backup systems can handle whatever the primary systems can't, but this storm seemed to overwhelm everything at once." Sarah was already opening access panels and beginning her detailed examination of the damaged systems. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The damage was indeed extensive, affecting not just the primary electrical systems, but also several of the backup and emergency systems that pilots relied on in crisis situations. "How long will the repairs take?" Lieutenant Morrison asked, joining them beside the aircraft. Sarah continued her examination before answering. "Under ideal conditions in a proper hangar with full support equipment, this would be at least a 12-hour job," she said. "Out here in this weather working with portable equipment?" She paused, calculating the time requirements against the worsening storm conditions. "But you can do it?" Captain Rodriguez pressed. "I can make the repairs," Sarah confirmed. "The question is whether the aircraft will be safe to fly after field repairs of this complexity." She didn't voice her other concern, that even if she could repair the aircraft, Captain Rodriguez might not have the experience to handle an F-22 with partially compromised systems in these weather conditions. She had noticed his nervousness and realized he was probably a relatively new F-22 pilot, someone with excellent basic skills but limited experience in extreme situations. As Sarah began setting up her equipment and preparing for the complex repair work ahead, she found herself studying the cockpit of the F-22. The familiar arrangement of controls and displays brought back a flood of memories. The feeling of the stick in her hands, the responsiveness of the aircraft to her commands, the incredible sensation of flight in the most advanced fighter jet ever built. She pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the work at hand. But as the storm continued to intensify around them and the time pressure mounted, Sarah began to realize that repairing the aircraft might be the easy part of this mission. The real challenge might come when it was time to decide who would take the controls and fly the F-22 out of this increasingly dangerous situation. 2 hours into the repair work, Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision despite the increasingly harsh conditions. The rain had turned to sleet, and the wind was now strong enough to require them to secure all loose equipment with heavy-duty straps. She had managed to restore power to about 60% of the F-22's electrical systems, but the most critical components were proving more challenging than anticipated. "How are we looking, Martinez?" Lieutenant Morrison called out over the sound of the storm. He had been coordinating with base command while Sarah worked, and the tension in his voice suggested the news wasn't good. "I've got the primary flight control computers back online, and most of the navigation systems are functional," Sarah replied, not looking up from the complex wiring harness she was repairing. "But the backup electrical systems are more damaged than I initially thought. It's going to take at least another hour to get them to minimum safe levels." Captain Rodriguez appeared beside her, his flight suit soaked, despite the rain gear he was wearing. "Martinez, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. "I've been watching you work, and you know these systems better than anyone I've ever seen. Where did you learn to work on F-22s like this?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, but she kept her hands steady as she continued working. "I've been specializing in fighter aircraft systems for years," she replied carefully. "The F-22 is complex, but once you understand the basic principles, it's just a matter of experience." "That's not what I mean," Captain Rodriguez said, moving closer. "I've seen maintenance specialists work on these aircraft before, and they're good at what they do. But you're not just fixing these systems. You're thinking like a pilot. You're checking things that only someone who's actually flown this aircraft would know to check." Sarah's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their work. She had been afraid this moment would come. Her knowledge of the F-22 went far beyond what any maintenance specialist should know, and she had been unconsciously performing checks and procedures that were second nature to a pilot but wouldn't occur to someone who had never flown the aircraft. "I studied the flight manuals extensively," she said, hoping to deflect his suspicions. "Understanding how the pilot uses these systems helps me maintain them better." Captain Rodriguez wasn't convinced. "Martinez, I need to know if there's something you're not telling me. This weather's getting worse, and I'm starting to worry about whether I can safely fly this aircraft out of here, even after you finish the repairs." Before Sarah could respond, Lieutenant Morrison's voice cut through their conversation. "Martinez, we've got a problem." Sarah and Captain Rodriguez hurried over to where the lieutenant was standing beside a field communications unit. His face was pale as he held the radio handset. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked. "Base Command just updated the weather forecast. The storm system is intensifying faster than anyone predicted. We now have less than 45 minutes before wind conditions become unsafe for any aircraft operations," Lieutenant Morrison explained. "After that window closes, we won't be able to extract the aircraft until the storm passes, which could be another 12 to 18 hours. Captain Rodriguez shook his head. "We can't leave the F-22 here for 18 hours. The security risks alone make that impossible, not to mention what the weather could do to the aircraft sitting exposed on this field." "There's more," Lieutenant Morrison continued grimly. "Command also reports that there's been increased activity in this area by groups interested in acquiring military technology. Intelligence suggests that our presence here might already be known, and we could have unwanted visitors if we stay much longer." Sarah felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. She looked back at the F-22, calculating how much work remained to be done. With the accelerated timeline, she might be able to get the aircraft to a barely flyable condition, but it would still be risky. "Can you finish the repairs in 45 minutes?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "I can get the essential systems working," Sarah replied, "but it won't be a full repair. The aircraft will be flyable, but with reduced capabilities and higher risk levels." "What kind of risks?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. Sarah chose her words carefully. The backup electrical systems will still be compromised, which means that if anything goes wrong during flight, the pilot will have fewer options to deal with the emergency. In good weather, with an experienced pilot, it would be manageable. But in these conditions, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. Captain Rodriguez stared at the aircraft for a long moment. "I have about 200 hours in the F-22, he said quietly. "Most of that has been in training scenarios and fair weather conditions. I've never attempted a takeoff in weather this severe, especially not in an aircraft with compromised systems." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah realized that the young pilot was essentially saying he didn't feel confident about flying the mission, but was prepared to try if it was the only option. "What other choices do we have?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. "We could strip the most sensitive components and destroy the aircraft," Captain Rodriguez suggested reluctantly. "It would prevent the technology from falling into the wrong hands, but it would mean losing a $100 million asset." Sarah found herself studying the F-22 again, her mind automatically running through takeoff procedures and emergency protocols. She knew she could fly this aircraft out safely, even in these conditions with partially repaired systems. The knowledge was like a constant whisper in the back of her mind, growing louder with each passing minute. "There might be another option," she said quietly, the words coming out before she could stop them. Both officers turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. Sarah felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff about to jump into an abyss that would change everything. "I mean that maybe Captain Rodriguez doesn't have to be the only pilot option available." Captain Rodriguez frowned. "I don't understand. There are no other qualified pilots here." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would end her carefully maintained anonymity forever. Actually, there might be. The storm continued to rage around them as Sarah prepared to reveal the secret she had kept hidden for over 11 years. In the distance, she could hear the sound of vehicles approaching, and she realized that time was running out in more ways than one. Whatever decision she made in the next few minutes would determine not only the fate of the F-22 and the success of the mission, but also the direction of the rest of her life. Lieutenant Morrison was about to ask another question when Sarah held up her hand to stop him. "Give me 5 more minutes to think about this," she said. "And let me get a few more critical systems online. Then we'll talk about our options for getting this aircraft out of here." As she returned to her work on the F-22's electrical systems, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities and consequences. The moment of truth was rapidly approaching, and she knew there would be no going back once she made her choice. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and through the storm, Sarah could see headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. Lieutenant Morrison raised his binoculars and studied the approaching convoy with growing concern. "Those aren't our vehicles," he announced grimly. "We've got 3 civilian trucks approaching from the east, and they're not slowing down." Captain Rodriguez grabbed his sidearm and checked his radio. "Base Command, this is Rescue Team Alpha. We have unknown civilian vehicles approaching our position. Request immediate guidance." The radio crackled with static before a voice came through. "Rescue Team Alpha. Be advised that intelligence indicates possible hostile interest in your location. Recommend immediate extraction of personnel and assets. Weather window closing in 28 minutes. Sarah looked up from her work on the F-22's electrical systems. She had managed to restore another 15% of functionality, but the aircraft was still not at optimal flying condition. More importantly, she could see the stress on Captain Rodriguez's face as he contemplated taking off in weather that was beyond his experience level. "Martinez, what's the status?" Lieutenant Morrison called out as he continued to watch the approaching vehicles. "The aircraft is flyable, but just barely," Sarah replied, making a decision that she knew would change everything. "However, I don't think Captain Rodriguez should attempt this takeoff." Captain Rodriguez turned to her with a mixture of relief and confusion. "What do you mean?" "If the aircraft is ready to fly, I have to take it up. It's my responsibility." Sarah stood up and faced both officers, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would end 11 years of carefully maintained secrecy. "Captain Rodriguez, you're a good pilot, but you don't have enough experience in extreme weather conditions to safely handle an F-22 with compromised systems. In weather like this, with electrical systems operating at reduced capacity, you need someone with extensive experience in emergency flying situations." "There is no one else," Lieutenant Morrison said, his voice tight with frustration. Unless you know of another F-22 pilot hiding somewhere on this airfield. Sarah took a deep breath. Actually, I do. Both men stared at her in confusion. The approaching vehicles were now close enough that they could hear engines over the storm, and the tension was becoming unbearable. What are you talking about, Martinez? Captain Rodriguez asked. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm a former Air Force captain, she said, her voice carrying a conviction that had been absent for 11 years. I flew F-22 Raptors for 3 years before leaving the service. I have over 400 hours in the F-22, including extensive experience in adverse weather conditions and emergency situations. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the storm and the approaching vehicles. Both officers stared at her as if she had just claimed to be someone entirely different, which, in a sense, she had. That's impossible, Lieutenant Morrison said. You're a civilian contractor. Your background check would have shown military service, especially as a pilot. My service record was classified and sealed as part of my discharge agreement, Sarah explained quickly, aware that time was running out. I left the Air Force under circumstances that required my military background to be kept confidential for national security reasons. Captain Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief. Even if that's true, you haven't flown in 11 years. You can't just jump back into an F-22 after that much time away. Sarah walked over to the aircraft and placed her hand on the fuselage. Some things you don't forget, she said quietly. Flying an F-22 is like riding a bicycle. Except the bicycle costs $100 million and can break the sound barrier. The approaching vehicles were now visible through the storm, and Sarah could see that they were indeed civilian trucks, but they were modified with additional antennas and equipment that suggested they weren't ordinary civilian vehicles. We need to make a decision now, Lieutenant Morrison said urgently. Those vehicles will be here in less than 5 minutes, and we still have to get this aircraft in the air. Sarah looked at Captain Rodriguez. I know this is a lot to process, but I need you to trust me. I can fly this aircraft out safely, even in these conditions with the current system status. But I need your permission as the mission pilot. Captain Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through the implications. If you're really a former F-22 pilot, why have you been working as a maintenance contractor for the past several years? Because I made a choice to leave that life behind, Sarah replied. But sometimes the past catches up with you, and sometimes you have to choose between keeping your secrets and doing what's right. The first of the approaching vehicles was now close enough that they could see it was heavily modified and carried sophisticated equipment. Lieutenant Morrison was speaking rapidly into his radio, updating base command on the developing situation. Martinez, or whoever you are, Captain Rodriguez said, even if I believe your story, I can't just turn over a classified aircraft to someone whose identity I can't verify. Sarah reached into her toolkit and pulled out a small object wrapped in plastic. She unwrapped it to reveal her original pilot's wings, the ones she had earned after completing F-22 training. These are mine, she said simply. I've carried them with me every day for 11 years, waiting for a moment when I might need them again. Captain Rodriguez took the wings and examined them closely. The serial numbers and markings were authentic, and Sarah could see recognition dawning in his eyes. Base Command, this is Captain Rodriguez, he said into his radio. I need immediate verification of the military service record for Sarah Martinez, former Air Force captain, F-22 qualified. This is an emergency request for mission-critical information. While they waited for the response, the first civilian vehicle pulled up about 100 yards away. Several men got out, all wearing heavy weather gear and carrying equipment that looked suspiciously like surveillance and communications gear. They're not approaching directly, Lieutenant Morrison observed. They're setting up some kind of equipment. Looks like they're planning to monitor our activities rather than confront us directly. The radio crackled to life. Captain Rodriguez, be advised that records confirm former Captain Sarah Martinez, classified discharge 11 years ago, extensive F-22 experience. Records are sealed, but pilot qualifications are verified. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Her secret was out, but now she had the opportunity to do what she knew was necessary. All right, Martinez, Captain Rodriguez said, handing her back her pilot's wings. If you can really fly this aircraft out of here safely, then I'm officially requesting that you take command of this mission. But I need your word that you can handle an F-22 with compromised electrical systems in weather conditions that are beyond normal operational parameters. Sarah looked at the F-22, then at the storm raging around them, and finally at the civilian vehicles that were clearly more than they seemed. "Captain Rodriguez, I give you my word as a former Air Force officer and as someone who has never forgotten how to fly. I can get this aircraft home safely." As she spoke, Sarah realized that she wasn't just talking about flying the F-22 back to base. She was talking about coming home herself, returning to the life and identity she had left behind 11 years ago. The secrets were finally out, and there was no going back now. Sarah approached the F-22's cockpit with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that she hadn't felt in over a decade. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the ladder leading up to the pilot's seat. But the trembling was from emotion rather than fear. Despite 11 years away from flying, being this close to the controls of an F-22 felt like coming home. "Martinez, are you sure about this?" Captain Rodriguez called out over the storm. The civilian vehicles had now deployed what appeared to be sophisticated monitoring equipment, and more vehicles were visible in the distance. Time was running critically short. "I'm sure," Sarah replied, her voice carrying more confidence than she had felt in years. She began her pre-flight inspection, her hands automatically moving through procedures that had been drilled into her during hundreds of hours of training and operational flying. As she climbed into the cockpit, Sarah was amazed at how familiar everything felt. The seat adjusted to her body as if it remembered her, and the arrangement of controls and displays was exactly as she recalled. The F-22's cockpit was like the control center of a spacecraft, with advanced displays and controls that represented the pinnacle of fighter aircraft technology. "Base Command, this is Captain Rodriguez," she heard over the radio. "Former Captain Martinez is assuming pilot duties for aircraft extraction. Estimated takeoff in 10 minutes. Sarah began the startup sequence, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. Despite the electrical damage, the aircraft's primary systems were responding well to her repairs. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and she felt the familiar vibration of the F-22's powerful turbofan engines coming to life. "How are the systems looking?" Lieutenant Morrison asked through the radio headset. "Better than expected," Sarah replied, running through her pre-flight checklist. "The electrical repairs are holding, and I've got about 80% functionality on most critical systems. The backup systems are still compromised, but the primary flight controls are solid." As she worked through the checklist, Sarah found herself remembering why she had loved flying the F-22 so much. This wasn't just an aircraft. It was a precision instrument that responded to the pilot's thoughts and intentions as much as to their physical inputs. The fly-by-wire system meant that the computer helped translate the pilot's commands into optimal aircraft control, but it still required skill and experience to fly effectively. "Martinez, we've got movement from those civilian vehicles," Captain Rodriguez reported. "They're starting to move closer to the airfield perimeter. Whatever you're going to do, you need to do it now." Sarah looked out at the storm conditions and made rapid calculations in her head. The wind was gusting up to 40 knots with occasional stronger gusts, and the visibility was reduced to less than a mile. These were definitely beyond normal operational parameters for most pilots, but Sarah had flown in worse conditions during her military service. "I'm ready for takeoff," she announced. "Everyone needs to clear the runway area immediately." As the ground team moved to safe positions, Sarah taxied the F-22 toward the runway. The aircraft felt different from what she remembered, heavier somehow and less responsive due to the electrical damage. But the basic flight characteristics were the same, and she could feel the aircraft's eagerness to return to its natural element. "Martinez, before you take off, I need to know something," Captain Rodriguez said over the radio. "Why did you really leave the Air Force? What happened 11 years ago that was serious enough to seal your records?" Sarah paused at the end of the runway, the F-22's engines at idle thrust as she considered how to answer. She had kept this secret for so long that speaking about it felt almost impossible. "I discovered something that certain people in the command structure didn't want exposed," she said finally. "I was given a choice between keeping quiet and leaving the service or facing a court-martial for insubordination and potentially treason. I chose to leave quietly." "What did you discover?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. "Evidence that classified F-22 technology was being sold to foreign governments by someone high in the Air Force command," Sarah replied. "I tried to report it through proper channels, but it became clear that the corruption went higher than I had imagined. When I persisted in trying to expose the truth, I was told that my continued service was no longer in the best interests of national security. The radio was silent for a moment, as everyone absorbed this information. Finally, Captain Rodriguez spoke. "Did you ever regret your choice to leave?" Sarah looked out at the storm and thought about the 11 years she had spent in exile from the life she had loved. "Every single day," she said quietly. "But I couldn't be part of a system that was betraying the very principles I had sworn to defend." "And now?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. "Now I have a chance to do something right," Sarah replied. "To use my skills to protect this aircraft and complete this mission. Sometimes that's the best redemption you can hope for." Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the F-22's engines respond with their characteristic surge of power. Despite the electrical damage, the aircraft was performing well, and she could feel its eagerness to fly. "All stations, this is Martinez. Beginning takeoff roll." As the F-22 accelerated down the short runway, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft coming alive beneath her. The nose came up smoothly, and within seconds she was airborne. Climbing into the storm-darkened sky, the aircraft responded beautifully to her inputs, and Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in years. Despite everything that had happened, despite 11 years away from flying, she was exactly where she belonged. The F-22 climbed steadily through the turbulent air, its stealth capabilities making it invisible to any potential threats on the ground. "Base Command, this is Martinez. Aircraft is airborne and climbing. All systems nominal. Estimated arrival at Peterson in 25 minutes. As she flew through the storm toward home, Sarah realized that this flight represented more than just a successful mission. It was her return to the life she had been forced to abandon, and perhaps the beginning of a chance to finally set things right. Below her, the storm continued to rage, but above the clouds, the sky was clear and infinite. For the first time in 11 years, Sarah Martinez was exactly where she was meant to be. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the briefing room at Peterson Air Force Base, wearing a crisp Air Force uniform with the rank insignia of Major. The promotion had come as part of her reinstatement to active duty, along with recognition for her actions during the emergency mission that had ended her 11 years of exile. The room was filled with senior officers, including Colonel Hayes and several officials from the Pentagon who had come to Colorado Springs specifically for this meeting. On the wall behind them was a detailed presentation about the investigation that had followed Sarah's return to military service. "Major Martinez," said General Patricia Williams, a 3-star general who had led the investigation into the corruption Sarah had originally tried to expose. "Your actions 3 months ago not only saved a valuable aircraft and completed a critical mission, but they also provided us with the key to uncovering one of the most significant security breaches in recent Air Force history." Sarah stood at attention, still adjusting to being back in uniform after so many years. The weight of the rank insignia on her shoulders felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. "The information you provided about the classified technology sales has led to the arrest of 12 individuals, including 2 general officers and several defense contractors," General Williams continued. "The investigation revealed that the corruption you discovered 11 years ago had continued and expanded significantly during your absence." Colonel Hayes stepped forward with a folder in her hands. "Major Martinez, the Air Force owes you an apology for the way your original reports were handled. The system failed you, and as a result, national security was compromised for over a decade." Sarah accepted the folder, knowing it contained her official reinstatement documents and a summary of the investigation findings. "Thank you, ma'am," she replied. "I'm just glad that the truth finally came out." "There's something else," General Williams said. "The Secretary of the Air Force has asked me to offer you command of a new squadron, being formed specifically to address security vulnerabilities in our most advanced aircraft programs. The position would make you one of the youngest squadron commanders in the Air Force, and you would report directly to the Pentagon." Sarah felt her heart race at the offer. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible when she had made the difficult decision to reveal her identity during the emergency mission. The squadron would be responsible for testing and evaluating security protocols for the F-22, F-35, and other classified aircraft programs, Colonel Hayes added. "Your unique combination of flying experience, technical expertise, and understanding of security vulnerabilities makes you the ideal candidate for this position." "I'm honored by the offer, ma'am," Sarah replied, "but I need to ask, What about the people who forced me out of the service 11 years ago? What guarantee do I have that the same thing won't happen again? General Williams smiled grimly. The investigation has led to a complete restructuring of oversight procedures for classified programs. The individuals responsible for suppressing your original reports are either in prison or facing court-martial proceedings. The Air Force has implemented new whistleblower protections and independent investigation protocols to ensure that what happened to you can never happen again. Sarah looked around the room at the assembled officers, many of whom had worked tirelessly over the past 3 months to uncover the truth and restore her reputation. She thought about Captain Rodriguez, who had visited her several times to thank her for taking command of the mission when he couldn't. She thought about Jake and the other maintenance personnel, who had been amazed to learn about her hidden background. "Ma'am, I accept the position," Sarah said finally. "But I have one condition." "What's that, Major?" General Williams asked. "I want to continue working with the maintenance teams at Peterson Air Force Base on a regular basis," Sarah said. "Those 11 years working as a contractor taught me things about aircraft systems that I never would have learned as a pilot alone. I think that perspective is valuable, and I don't want to lose touch with the people who keep these aircraft flying." General Williams nodded approvingly. "That can certainly be arranged. In fact, that kind of hands-on approach is exactly what we need in this new squadron." After the official ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself alone in the briefing room, looking out at the flight line where F-22s were taking off and landing in the late afternoon sun. The storm that had changed everything 3 months ago seemed like a lifetime ago, though she could still remember every detail of that flight. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, now wearing the rank insignia of Major himself. His promotion had come after his exemplary handling of the emergency situation and his recommendation of Sarah for reinstatement. "How does it feel to be back in uniform?" he asked, joining her at the window. "Different than I expected," Sarah replied honestly. 11 years ago when I left, I thought I was walking away from everything I had ever wanted. I never imagined I would get a second chance." "Do you think you made the right choice back then?" Rodriguez asked. "Choosing to leave rather than fighting the corruption from within?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think I made the only choice I could at the time," she said. "But I also think that sometimes you have to leave a place before you can come back and make it better. Those 11 years taught me things about integrity and perseverance that I might not have learned otherwise. And now I have the chance to make sure that other people don't have to make the same impossible choice I did," Sarah replied. "The Air Force is stronger when good people can speak up about problems without fear of retaliation." As they watched the F-22s performing their training missions, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed. 3 months ago, she had been a maintenance contractor with a secret past. Now she was a major in the Air Force with a promising future and the opportunity to make a real difference in protecting national security. The secret that she had kept hidden for over a decade was finally out, but rather than destroying her life, its revelation had given her the chance to reclaim everything she had lost and more. Sarah Martinez was no longer living in exile from her true calling. She was home, and she was exactly where she belonged. The F-22 squadron she would soon command was still being formed, but Sarah already had plans for how she would run it. She would combine the flying excellence that had made her a good pilot with the technical expertise she had gained as a contractor and the hard-won wisdom that came from 11 years of keeping silent about injustice. As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, Sarah Martinez walked across the flight line toward her new office, ready to begin the next chapter of a career that had taken an unexpected but ultimately redemptive path. The secrets were finally out, and the future was full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine.